It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. She is Jone Johnson Lewis. Jone has been an ethical culture leader since 1991. Currently, she leads the Riverdale-Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture in New York. And she is a third-generation humanist who worked in the technology industry before turning to congregational leadership as a profession. Jone is also an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister and has worked as a faculty member at the Meadville Lombard Theological School and the Humanist Institute, which are also both her alma maters. Jone has worked as a life coach and ran popular websites about women's history and wisdom quotes for many years. We are so lucky to have Jone here with us today to talk about a little known ethical culture figure, Moncure Conway. So take it away, Jone. Oops. You're muted. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. I want to open with a quote from Maya Angelou, who said, "Won't it be wonderful when Black history and Native American history and Jewish history and all of US history is taught from one book, just US history?" And also in honor of Black History Month, I want to open with a quote from John Lewis, too. He wrote fairly recently, "You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Study the path of others to make your way easier and more abundant." As a guest speaker today, I offered this talk to the Mid-River Society as something I think brings together several elements. It'll touch on ethical and humanist history. It'll touch on historical social justice issues that may inform our present, and it's also relevant for Black History Month. For almost 20 years, I used to write about women's history for the web. And from the beginning, I included Black women as women. Every February, I would get emails from people saying, "Where is White History Month?" Well, perhaps this month is also a time for white people to reflect on our role in the racialized history of this country. A few years ago, I was asked by a Black woman, what was in the mind of the white enslavers in our history? How could they justify their role in that history, claiming to own human beings? Did any of them change their mind? And what does that mean for us today? And so I spoke then, and I speak again today, on someone with a relationship to our ethical movement, but more importantly, someone who could speak with insight into the question, what did white people in the time of enslavement do and think? What did it take to change their minds? And so I'm going to focus on a time in our history as a nation, a time when what was called the peculiar institution laid the groundwork for today's racial injustice. My hope is that by looking at this period of time through an unusual perspective, we can gain some insights that help understand where we've been and where we might be able to go. So we start with that peculiar institution. That phrase was used in the early 19th century to refer to a particular system. The system was developed in the area that became the United States. It was a system developed to hold people of African descent in enslavement for life and to pass on that condition of being enslaved and considered as property to the children of such people. Yes, it is true that others in world history enslaved people. And yes, there were other ethnic groups that were held in involuntary servitude for a fixed period of time, without their children inheriting that condition. But never before had there been such a complete system of chattel slavery as was invented in the so-called New World. The assumption that some people and their descendants were property based on the color of their skin. Enslavement was practiced in the northern United States. The last enslaved person in New York State was freed, many don't know this, in 1862. But most of the laws and policies that upheld the enslavement of people of African descent were developed in Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and other states in the southern half of the growing United States. These laws began in the 1600s and 1700s. The laws continued to evolve well into the 19th century. Most states in the North had abolished slavery within their borders by the early 19th century. Originally, that phrase, peculiar institution, was used with the meaning of peculiar as meaning our own. It did not originally mean strange, though the words in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal was in sharp contradiction with it. By the early 19th century in the United States, people of European descent had come to think of themselves as a race, not separate ethnicities, and as a race that was superior to other races. They had come to group everyone with a dark skin from Africa as a race that was not only inferior, but that could and should be enslaved. There were always some of those who were called white who didn't agree with this. And throughout the 17 and 1800s, some parts of the world saw laws and systemic practice change towards abolishing this new system of enslavement. But I'm not here to give you just a history of how the enslavement of some human beings by others came to be. I'm here actually to tell you the story of one man's life, a life that shows us some of the details of how that system worked and didn't work. Moncure Daniel Conway, whose life is my window into history today, was born on March 17th, 1832 in Stafford County, Virginia. This is an area of Virginia not far from the Jamestown settlement, a place where 200 years earlier, the English colonists captured the adult woman called Pocahontas, daughter of Chief Powhatan of the Powhatan Confederacy, taking her into captivity. An area today that is at the southern end of the wide Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Moncure Daniel Conway. His three names come from the Moncures, the Daniels, and the Conways, so-called Virginia first families. His father, Walter Peyton Conway, was a, quote, gentleman farmer who owned a textile mill and who served at times as a county judge and state representative. Moncure's mother, born Margaret Stone Daniel, was the granddaughter of Thomas Stone of Maryland, who signed the Declaration of Independence. Moncure's uncle and father defended the doctrine of states' rights in Virginia. Moncure's great uncle, Peter Vivian Daniel, was a United States Supreme Court justice who would, in various decisions, uphold enslavement as lawful. Peter Daniel voted to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and was one of the justices supporting the Dred Scott decision in 1857 when Moncure Conway was 25 years old. Two of Moncure's brothers fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. During his early years, Moncure Conway grew up in a household where his father held as property several dozen people of African descent. Most of these people worked in the mill, some in the house, and a few on the land. His father and mother had converted to Methodism. In Moncure's childhood, Methodism in the southern states was beginning to split between a pro-slavery faction, which Moncure's uncle Eustace Conway was part of, and another faction that held that slavery was wrong and should be gradually abolished, which Moncure's father, Walter, was originally part of. Walter Conway was also locally known for opposing any violent treatment of those who were enslaved. So when it came time to go to college, Moncure went to college, a Methodist college in Pennsylvania, graduated in 1859. His mentor there was against slavery. And after Moncure actually saw a Black man lynched, he turned to a study of the law to try to change the system that turned a blind eye on lynching. And he soon saw that as a lawyer, he wasn't going to make much difference. So he became instead a Methodist minister, riding a circuit in Virginia. He unsuccessfully proposed a system of free schools in Virginia, aimed primarily at poorer whites. Those who opposed such schools did so out of fear that these schools would bring in, quote, Northern ideas, meaning opposition to enslavement. Moncure's religious ideas kept evolving, and he soon found himself no longer able to be a Methodist. He became a Unitarian and went off to Harvard to study. He graduated in 1854. While at Harvard, he met and befriended such local luminaries as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker, and anti-slavery advocates William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. His political views also evolved during this time, from being anti-slavery to becoming an abolitionist. At the time, anti-slavery generally meant that you wanted to end that, quote, peculiar institution, but gradually. Abolitionists were for more immediately ending it. In his autobiography, Moncure Conway writes of his time in Boston in 1854 and seeing an incident, the freeing of Anthony Burns. So how many of you here are familiar with the Anthony Burns event from your American history classes? You know, very few are. I have come, though, to believe that this is one of the major turning points in American history. Burns, who was a self-taught preacher, had been enslaved in Stafford County near where Conway grew up. And Conway actually knew the man who claimed to own Anthony Burns. And in 1853, Burns had escaped from Virginia to Boston and changed his name. But in 1854, a year after he escaped, he was seen on the street by someone who recognized him, and then he was arrested under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act. That act essentially overrode Massachusetts state law, which did not recognize the enslavement of anyone. So on May 26th of that year, with Anthony Burns jailed in the courthouse, a crowd, including abolitionists, both white and black, stormed the courthouse to free him. A federal marshal was stabbed and killed in the fight. Burns was sent back to the South. He was not freed. And then abolitionists had to pay his so-called owner in order to free him. Burns returned then first to Massachusetts and eventually moved to Canada, where he was free from the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act, which could have enslaved him again on the word of any white man. This incident escalated the culture war that was then happening in the United States. William Lloyd Garrison, as a result of this, burned the Fugitive Slave Act and the United States Constitution. In Massachusetts, a new organization was formed, calling itself the Anti-Manhunting League. Moncure Conway was there at the courthouse in Boston during the fight to try to free Burns. He was an observer and part of the crowd. Seeing this event caused him to question, should he have been more active as a participant and not just an observer? And out of this, he solidified his commitment to the abolition of slavery. He was then called as a minister to serve the First Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. After a few months there, he preached what Horace Greeley, in a newspaper article about it, called a straight-out anti-slavery sermon. Well, there were members of the congregation who still held people in slavery, and that was likely a factor in the reactions to the sermon. Many leaders in the congregation were appalled that he had preached a sermon with politics in it. A committee met and, quote, deeply deplored it, but they didn't take any other action. Conway took the inaction as encouragement. He issued a pamphlet stating that ministers and churchgoers were, in fact, obligated to attack injustice, and it had a duty to oppose powers and laws that were unjust. Well, that pamphlet resulted in a warning from a committee of the church that political speech was incompatible with the higher purposes of the church. Conway traveled to Pennsylvania and Boston while he was still a minister in DC, giving anti-slavery speeches. He wasn't a full-out Garrisonian abolitionist quite yet, William Lloyd Garrison at that point had begun to call for the secession of the northern states if slavery were not abolished in the South, a position which was vigorously denounced by those in the South who had always defended enslavement on the basis of states' rights. Moncure Conway still believed that laws could be changed, ending enslavement and avoiding a split of the Union. Other Unitarian ministers of the day, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson of Massachusetts, urged him to continue his advocacy of abolition. So he's in Washington, D.C. as a minister, and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was a member of the congregation when he was in D.C. In 1856, Sumner, on the floor of the Senate, gave an impassioned two-day speech, blasting the pro-slavery faction in Kansas as murderous robbers. In his speech, he verbally attacked Senator Brooks from South Carolina, saying that Brooks had chosen a mistress, slavery. You know, I was thinking a lot about this incident and what happened next last month and through January's events in Congress. 2 days after Sumner gave that speech, a Congressman Brooks, who was a cousin of Senator Brooks, entered the Senate. There on the floor of the Senate, he beat Senator Sumner over the head with a cane so hard that the beating caused serious head injuries that kept Sumner bedridden for over a year and kept him from fulfilling his Senate work for years. The House refused to vote to expel Representative Brooks, who had beaten the senator. The congressman resigned anyway and returned to be celebrated in his home state. Many people from the so-called slave states sent him new canes to express their support for the beating. This beating probably did make it into your American history books, but I find that it's usually minimized. Well, Moncure Conway, as Sumner's minister, was especially outraged at that beating. He again spoke out against slavery, giving a sermon about 6 weeks after the caning, much more political than ever before. In it, he warned of a possible civil war. And that did it for the congregation. They fired him. He then went to serve an explicitly anti-slavery Unitarian congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was the minister there from 1855 until 1861. During those years, Conway's religious ideas also evolved. He had become a well-known member of the radical wing of Unitarians, but eventually that wasn't even radical enough. He declared himself no longer a Christian or a Unitarian. About a third of the church members left, and the remaining congregation redefined itself as a free church, not associated with any dogma. Also in Cincinnati, early in his time there, he met and married his wife, Ellen Davis Dana, who was a Unitarian raised in an abolitionist family. She was also already active in the growing women's rights movement. Despite the fact that Conway had by that time become an ardent abolitionist, his marriage helped him to learn some new lessons. Well, a very big lesson he learned was when he returned to visit his family in Virginia, bringing his new wife. On that visit, he had many conversations with the servants, as they were always called in his family. They had already heard somehow that he had become an abolitionist. So on this visit, they shared with him their stories of hardship and their dreams of freedom. As Conway tells the story in his autobiography, he was shocked to hear this. Even though he'd come to see that ending slavery was the ethical thing to do, he still thought, because he never heard evidence otherwise, that the enslaved people themselves were completely satisfied with their position. And especially if they were held by families like his, where violence was not used. There was even one servant who his father used to send on trips to Baltimore with large sums of money. Why, Conway tells us he had thought before, would that man return if he really wanted to be free? So he must have been okay with his situation. Well, on this trip to Virginia, Conway got his answers. It was because the man was thinking about his family, his wife and children that he'd left in Virginia, and he would not risk their safety by winning his own freedom. So Conway began to question even the assumptions he still had. Of course, it wasn't safe before for people who were in almost constant connection to him throughout his growing years to say one single word about their real hopes and dreams. Of course, these people really wanted freedom, even if they knew that they could not tell that to those who were part of the system that enslaved them. You know, it sounds so simple from the perspective of our time, but for him in that moment, it was a revelation, revealing not just his former unthinking ignorance, but also how the system worked to keep people of European descent ignorant and naive. And I think that's a lesson for us today. We hear increasingly the cries for Black lives to matter, and we also know many people we call white who are confused or resistant. And that is how the system of racism maintains itself, keeping some people ignorant and some people unable to speak their truth. Even for the abolitionist Moncure Conway, who had already put his career and livelihood on the line for his beliefs, he realized how much he had still been carrying false assumptions. Well, I started this talk as I was writing it with a question: how did white people of the South feel about what they were doing? Conway, in his memoirs and other writings, tells us um, something of that answer. Some of the people were violent in their suppression of even a little resistance by those held enslaved. Conway later wrote about how such violence was a logical consequence of enslavement. If you're going to keep people enslaved, which is not a natural condition for human beings, he argued that it will require increasing violence to deal with the fears around resistance and rebellion. And at the same time, there were others who held people enslaved, um, who believed that good treatment was good enough. They didn't hear any of their so-called servants complain, and they didn't ask themselves whether people could dare under that system to express their reality to people who had the power of life and death over them. So think about that. Oops. For today too, that a system of injustice based on skin color and perceived race may very well logically become more and more ardent and violent in suppression of those who are oppressed. Only dismantling and eradicating the system will stop the violence that disproportionately targets one part of the nation's people. Well, back to the story of Moncure Conway. That visit home with his wife, it resulted in learning for Conway. It also resulted in a long split with his family. When Ellen and Moncure first arrived on that trip, a little 4-year-old girl came running to greet them, daughter of house servants, again in the euphemism of the time. A little girl of African descent ran to greet them, and Ellen picked her up and hugged her. For all that Moncure Conway's family had taught him that good treatment was the right way to relate to the servants, hugging this little girl was over the line for the rest of his family. It became apparent that Moncure's family would, after that incident, never approve of his wife. And the story of this soon spread around town. Moncure, on a visit to town, happened to overhear plans to tar and feather himself and Ellen. And so Moncure and Ellen left far earlier than they'd planned. It was 17 years before he reconciled with his family. He did maintain a correspondence with his mother through those years, but she regularly chided him for being anti-slavery. Well, that visit was in the mid-1850s. Moncure and Ellen returned to the Cincinnati, where Moncure continued to preach against slavery. He also edited a weekly anti-slavery newspaper and traveled on the national abolitionist circuit. When Lincoln was elected president and the Southern states formed the Confederacy because they saw his election as the death knell of that peculiar institution, at that time, the Civil War broke out. So in 1862, just after the war had begun, Conway found himself in Washington, D.C. again, this time for a lecture series for abolition at the Smithsonian. He argued there that if the president would declare the abolition of slavery, it would weaken the Confederacy and end the war quickly. He and another minister, William Henry Channing, earned a meeting to talk with President Lincoln about this argument. And of course, we know from events that Lincoln failed to agree at that time. It was during this trip to Washington that Conway received word that the Union Army had taken control of the area around Stafford, Virginia, where his family lived. By the time the war had begun, his father had, in the polarizing atmosphere, moved from his vaguely anti-slavery but not right now position to being ardently pro-slavery. His mother, who had not similarly moved her position, though she was not for abolition, said she opposed enslavement in principle because of her close proximity to people in her role as the woman of the house. She was responsible for nursing those held as slaves in their illnesses, for bringing them food, and for helping with childbirth. And his mother, in fact, moved to Pennsylvania for the rest of the war, separating from her husband. Well, but in this moment, when he heard about the Union troops, Moncure Conway realized he had an opportunity. He could safely travel to Stafford County with the protection of the Union troops in charge there and take the people who had been enslaved by his father and get them to the northern states and freedom. In his later years, when he was writing his autobiography, Conway had already become a rationalist and a complete disbeliever in any spirit world or any deity. But he still tells this following story in retrospect. He has disbelief that it happened, but as he said, he had to write it because it did happen. So that night, after he had heard he could go to Stafford, he went to sleep, prepared to travel in the morning to his family's estate. Then he awoke suddenly in the middle of the night with an overwhelming urge that told him to go to a specific house in Georgetown, which was then the area in Washington, D.C., where freedmen lived. Now, he couldn't explain to himself or even believe this very specific impulse, but he nevertheless decided he had to get up in the middle of the night and follow it. And when he got to the house, he found several dozen people who had been enslaved by his family. They had already made it to Washington, having heard that Moncure was there. And they had intended to send a messenger to him in the morning to let him know. If it had not been for that middle of the night impulse, Conway would, by that morning, have been gone to Stafford County. So pretty dramatic, but that's not the end of the drama. Moncure Conway was determined that these people would escape to some land he had been able to obtain in Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, and the congregation he had served. That meant he would have to take them through Maryland, where enslavement was still enforced. At that time, there was no train that went from Washington, D.C. through Baltimore to the north. You had to get, in Baltimore, you had to get off the train from Washington and then walk a mile to another train station. So there was Moncure Conway, 30-year-old white man, with 30-some Black men, women, and children in Baltimore, everyone subject to arrest on demand. They first walked through an all-white neighborhood. Conway tells later how, despite his reluctance, those with him convinced him to tie them together and act as if he still owned them, all to protect their very lives as white crowds gathered to watch this unusual procession. And then during the walk, they came to an all-Black neighborhood where free Black people lived. The crowds in this neighborhood were not so positive about a white man taking a crowd of roped together Black people through the streets. Conway describes how his feelings were somewhat ominous and he became afraid for his life. Until some of those with him passed words about what was really happening. The ropes tying them together came off, and the crowd began shouting, not in anger, but in celebration and joy. Well, that's still not the end of the drama. When they got to the train station that would take them north, Conway followed the protocol of the time and saw those with him to the colored waiting room. And then he went to buy tickets for all of them. No, the ticket seller said, he could not sell tickets for Black people to go to the North. Why not? Because of the Fugitive Slave Act. If someone claimed ownership later, that person could sue the railroad for complicity in property loss, and the cost to the railroad could be great. Railroad policy forbid them from selling tickets then to or for any Black person, as they might be faking their papers, even if they had papers showing they were free. Well, Conway despaired. He had not realized this barrier to his plan. He shared his frustration with the ticket seller, who until then had not realized that these people were claimed by Conway's father as slaves. And thus the man before him technically had a great financial interest in the 31 people in the other waiting room. It was a huge loss of dollars, the clerk realized, to just free people instead of selling them. So the ticket seller disappeared. Conway was still in the waiting room trying to figure out next steps when the ticket seller returned. He had had a change of heart. This before him was not just some radical asking the railroad to take a risk, but someone making a great personal sacrifice. And that impressed the ticket seller enough to take a risk of his own. Although he could not sell tickets to the people Conway was with, he had found an empty baggage car on a train going north. He was willing to allow them to sneak onto that car for the trip to Ohio. He showed them the car, and everyone, including Conway, got on for the journey to Ohio. Conway writes about how the adults in the moving railroad car got the children to sleep while the adults watched out the small window in the car as they proceeded north. Suddenly, at one station, those watching shouted and woke up everyone else, including the children. Conway wrote of this moment. I observed that every eye danced, every tongue was loosened, and after some singing, they all dropped off to sleep. It was not until the next day that I learned that the station which had wrought such a transformation was the dividing line between the slave and the free states. How they knew it, I cannot divine. It was a small place, but there the shadow of slavery ended. You know, despite living in Stafford County, Virginia for all that time, all these people, all the adults knew where the Mason-Dixon line was, even though Conway did not. Conway accompanied them to their new home near Yellow Springs, Ohio, where I understand some of their descendants still live. Conway returned to Cincinnati and later moved far away, but he continued to support that community as long as he lived. So a bit later in the war, during another period of Union occupation of his home area, he visited again. He found that his home had not been destroyed as he had expected. The Union Army had realized it was associated with him, who was already known as one of the abolitionists. And so instead they had converted it into a hospital for the wounded. Walt Whitman served as a nurse there. But during the war, Conway became increasingly uncomfortable with another reality. In abolitionist circles, his Southern heritage triggered suspicion about his real allegiances. The people he was associated with and the cause which he was risking so much were unable to see him as fully trustworthy. And so he took on a different work. He took a position with a congregation in London, England. This group had moved, like Conway, beyond Unitarianism to a more radical, dogma-free form of unity based only on ethics. Does that sound a little familiar? And Conway also took on the mission while there of another kind of action often not mentioned in our history books about the Civil War. He was there to keep the United Kingdom out of the war when many expected that the UK could very well decide to back the Confederacy, given the UK's close ties to the cotton industry. If the UK had entered the war on the side of the South, the Civil War might have been far longer and bloodier and could have had a different ending. Moncure and Ellen moved to London in 1863, sent on this mission by the American abolitionists. He spoke and wrote about the realities of the peculiar institution while he was there. He shared gruesome stories he personally knew. He talked about his own learning, that you cannot trust the lack of resistance to mean that people were happy with their situation. At one point, he got in trouble with the US Secretary of State with one action. Without any authorization, Conway contacted an official of the Confederacy, offering that the United States would stop pursuing the war if the Confederacy just emancipated everyone who was enslaved. Conway also, while in England, became a prolific writer and a literary agent for many American writers. His religious ideas continued to move. He began to completely reject theism and to move towards what we'd today call humanism. He and the congregation he served moved even more completely outside of their Unitarian circle. Conway remained in England until 1886. He was a part of many liberal and radical circles. He counted among his friends Charles Dickens and Charles Darwin. He helped to promote the writings of Thomas Paine, and he wrote a biography of Paine, almost single-handedly rescuing him from a near obscurity, this key American religious and political thinker and activist. Conway wrote the first strong argument against why the United States cannot be conceived of as a Christian nation. Arguments today for that same thing draw heavily on Conway's argument, like the Treaty of Tripoli. Moncure Conway finally gave up his position as the leader of that congregation at South Place in London to return to the United States in 1886. A young man, Stanton Coit, replaced him. Stanton Coit had been training in New York with a man named Felix Adler. The London congregation became the South Place Ethical Society, a name it retains to this day. Its meeting room is called Conway Hall. Coit left after 6 years, and Conway was invited back, becoming thereby in 1892 an ethical culture leader. Conway and his wife returned to America a few years later in 1897, this time because Ellen was dying of cancer and wanted to die in the United States. Then, with the Spanish-American War, Conway became a pacifist. Now widowed, he moved to France, where he died in 1907. He is buried in Westchester County, New York, with his wife and their children. In 2004, Virginia Governor Mark Warner issued a proclamation honoring Moncure Conway. Why did he do this? Well, Conway was honored as the only known descendant of any of the founding fathers to himself voluntarily, personally, and physically lead people who had been enslaved to freedom. Conway spent his life in both the religious and activist worlds. Perhaps this short sentence he wrote late in life best sums up his mission. All religion and all ethics are summed up in justice. William Salter, another ethical leader, wrote at Conway's death, "The Spirit was in him and led him, something greater than any special truths. Yes, the spirit of humanity and of right was in him, and this was more than any special social or moral views." At the end of Conway's autobiography, he writes these words, "O my reader from whom I now part, do not offer the prayer, give peace to our time, but do thy part to answer it. When at least, though the world be at strife, there shall be peace in thee." A sometimes dramatic story, and often dramatic life. Some questions you might think about as you consider his story. How is his story different from the situation we face today And how does it resonate with challenges of our own time? For Black History Month, I think it's worthwhile to ponder, as a majority white audience today, how do white people learn to understand racism against Black people? And how can white people be active in ending anti-Black racism, working towards a just, equal, inclusive, and diverse society? What might we be willing to give up some of so that others can be liberated? In Conway's story, he thought that the idea of abolition wasn't enough. He had to act, sometimes at great risk. How do you move beyond just calling for peace, freedom, truth, justice, to answering the call yourself? And so as I end, I leave you with those questions to ponder.
Thank you, Joan. Fascinating story and awesome thought-provoking questions. If anyone has a question for Joan, we do have a couple of minutes. Just speak up if you have anything that you want to add or ask. Just be sure to unmute yourself.
And I realized that I forgot to show the Conway picture, so I'm going to do that now as people gather their thoughts. These are kind of a progression through time of Conway. A very impressive beard. And that's with his wife and a grandchild. And in his old age when he returned.
Thank you. Questions, anyone?
I don't have a question, but I will comment. I just wanted to say that you speak so eloquently. I'm pretty jealous of that, but the story is definitely one that I was not familiar with, and it kind of makes me feel a little bit ashamed of that because I do seek out the true history of, America as much as I can. But it was quite emotional for me, especially the part where they unshackled the individuals and then, sorry, I'm getting choked up, and then began celebrating. I think that these are conversations that we should be having every day.
Thank you, Shana.
I really don't have a question either. It's more of a statement. I just find it more upsetting that a lot of the things that you were saying, the history there, I don't remember learning that in school. I don't remember my children learning that in school, and how important all those things are, that the major things that have happened to help form this country that have been omitted. And I know the reason why, because these textbooks are written by white males that don't want that kind of stuff out there or want to minimize it, and it's just upsetting, but I'm glad I was able to hear your speech. It was wonderful, and it's some good history that I wish I would have had when I was younger.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to remember is that for decades there was a law on the book in Texas, which buys a significant percentage of the textbooks in America, that no history textbook could make America look bad. And so by law, they couldn't use textbooks that really told the full story. I mean, most of us did learn about the caning of Senator Sumner, but not how bad it was.
Isn't that, kind of similar to the types of things that Trump was trying to pass in the un-American curriculum that he claimed we were facing?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Some of your words went in and out for me.
I was just stating it kind of is, it's familiar to me just because of what we just went through with what Trump was trying to pass with our education system and how he quoted it as un-American to teach the real history.
Yeah, the very brief surfacing of that 1776 commission with even more of a slanted story about the history.
Joan, someone asks if you can speak about what changed Lincoln's mind.
Probably pragmatism all along. That, there's some evidence that Lincoln had a personal commitment against slavery from a very young age, but as a candidate and then president, he promised that he wouldn't bother the system if he was elected, which was probably pragmatic. And early in the war, it looked like the North had such an advantage that he thought that if they could win the war without disturbing enslavement, there was a better chance of reunification, which was his primary goal as president, was the reunification. And then he eventually signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which only had an effect in the southern states. It, for instance, did not cover Maryland, because it was strategically, by that time he knew, wise to undercut that strength that the Confederacy had of having people who were enslaved being able to, for instance, run a farm while the man of the house was off fighting the war.
Thank you. One last question, if anybody has a
I got
question.
one.
Go ahead.
I got one. You mentioned the Treaty of Tripoli. I had to look that up and was just curious why you mentioned it, but I see it right here, 1796. And the thing about that treaty, it has the line, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Well, that's
Right.
supposed to know. Thanks for.
Yeah. And when Conway was writing mid-19th century, in contradiction to those people who were saying then that this is a Christian nation, he brought in that argument. And that has been one of the key arguments in that discussion ever since.
Yeah, I want to just thank you for your presentation. It was very good, very interesting. A lot of stuff that I have no idea of, and like I think somebody else said, it's kind of shaming when you realize that these things have happened in the world. And as much as I think I keep apprised of them, I don't, and I feel bad about that at times. But for everybody, there's an article about North St. Louis County in the paper today, and if you read just the front page section, so many things about the way we treated African Americans over our history of this country is part of that, part of the problem, if not the problem. So maybe just if you get a chance, everybody, just the article about North County is interesting. That's where I grew up. So anyway, thought I'd add that. Thanks so much for doing this. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Joan. Let's give her a hand. Thank you. So before we conclude, I just want to announce that a lot of our committees are meeting, the committees that people signed up for at our membership meeting in January. And it's not too late if you would like to join in on any of those committees.